Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from the Masterminds World headquarters, in other words, my house. And I am so happy to welcome you back to the Philanthropy Mastermind series with our friend Tiffany Allen, who I will introduce to you in a moment, but you just have to hold on for a second for that. Of course, you know why you're here. You're here for another session in the series, which has been going on since 2016, now with about 500 programs with leaders in the sector. And what we do rarely, however, is address the topic today of grants and grant seeking. So this is a really special one for me since I started as a grant maker, but I'm really seriously out of touch. And we have a person who is definitely in touch with that today with our guest. I want to make sure that you can participate actively today, though. So you can do that in two ways. You already saw that in the slides leading up to this. One is to use the chat. And I really want to tell you how much I appreciate those who have already said hello. Continue doing that right there and use the chat as your sandbox. It's a great place to play. We want to make sure that's for you. We also have Q&A, as you saw, and as you can see at the bottom of your page, it's a perfect place to post your questions since we can't see or hear you, but we definitely want to hear from you. So please do utilize that throughout. This is going to be conversational today, no slides. Definitely a chance for you to ask your questions. I have a few, but yours are probably going to be better. So hold on to those. And one last note, which is that this series is brought to you by DonorSearch, but unless our guest talks about them for some reason, she may or may not, we won't be talking about them today. That doesn't mean we don't love them. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't have done any of these sessions going back to 2016. So if you want to know more about them or see anything else in this series, you can do that by going over to donorsearch.net, looking under the resources tab for recordings, where a recording of this will be placed there later, but don't leave. And also there are other sessions from throughout for CFRE credit as well as our podcast. So with that, I would like to introduce, of course, Tiffany Allen. Tiffany is, among many things, the founder and CEO of Boss on a Budget, which is my favorite name for a company in the space, which she founded back in 2016 to combine her two loves, which are teaching and community. And that's probably very reductive for what she's managing to do, which is to help make sure that many organizations, but especially organizations that are trying to figure out how to make it work, can fulfill their promise because they can raise the money they need to do it. And grants are central to that. And so we are so happy that she could hang out today and answer some questions. Thank you so much for doing this, Tiffany.
Yes, Jay, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. I can talk a little bit about my background, but I'm more interested in just sharing my knowledge and answering your questions as well. So I'll just share just a little bit. So as Jay said, I have a business called Boss on a Budget, and I teach people to start nonprofits and I teach them how to raise money. And that's it. It's just that simple. And I do it because there are a lot of people out there who have a passion for doing good, but they don't have the knowledge. Like they know about nonprofits a little bit, but they're not sure about the mechanics of it all. So I try to teach it at a basic level so everyone can understand. And it's really about how to access resources as well, because it's really hard to scale and meet your missions if you don't have financial resources. We all know that. And a part of that is also teaching you how to increase your visibility. So I focus on new nonprofits and I focus on small nonprofits, and small to me probably doesn't mean small to everyone else, but like micro, like under 250,000 a year budget is where I really like to play. So just want to give you guys a background on that. And I'll just say the reason why I wanted to talk about grants is because all of my career, I'm actually a social worker. And in all of my career, I've worked with national foundations and we work in the foster care space, and I see how they fund and the assumptions that a lot of nonprofits make about how foundations move, they're wrong. So I wanted to kind of explain like how to attract funders. And I teach from that perspective about how to get grants through relationships. So I hope that what I'm sharing today for you guys is helpful.
I know it's going to be, and I'm going to try to keep a watchful eye on the Q&A throughout because of that. Do you mind if I ask kind of informally, this isn't a real poll, but Tiffany, if we just ask the audience, how many, if they're from a small organization, maybe an organization of under $250,000 or under $1 million, we all define small differently. And we can just look at the chat for a second and see what people have to say. I think that would be helpful as a framing device. And if you'd like to say the kind of organization you work with, maybe that's helpful too. But these social service organizations that you're talking about, that you've worked with, is it particularly tough for them to figure out how to frame what they're trying to do and find the right people to help them to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think because there are a lot of myths around grants in particular, a lot of people assume that grants are the only way that nonprofits make money, especially for people who are starting from the ground up. So they make a lot of assumptions about like where money flows and where they should spend their time. So that delays them a lot because they should be focusing more on building their donor base and raising their visibility and their credibility. And sometimes they focus more on like filling out applications.
Mm.
And a lot of times they haven't even fleshed out what their program model is or their case statement or why they're even like starting a nonprofit. And they have to do that foundational work first. So that's another reason why I started teaching, to get people kind of focused on their infrastructure first and how to talk about their work and how to message it. And then you start building those relationships.
And just as a reference point, you might be able to see this, you might not, but we're seeing organizations of all different sizes here. So there are ones that are over a million, over 5 million, under 250,000, lots of different things. And I hope you all stick around because this issue about grants is not just for small organizations, right? And the problems that people encounter, the ones you just mentioned, the foundational pieces, I've seen those in really small organizations. I've seen them in organizations that are trying to figure out how to grow. Can you talk a little bit about the foundational pieces for a minute? You mentioned the case statement as being one, but what pieces do you try to help people line up before they can even make a successful application to anybody for anything?
Yeah, so it's going to sound really basic to some of you guys, but I think it's important. First of all, you got to start with your vision and your mission. I think a lot of people have an idea that they want to do something, but they don't understand why they want to do it. They haven't fleshed it out and they're not sure what they're going to do to get there. So I think starting with the vision and the mission to help guide all the decisions that they make and help to figure out where their alignments are when they're trying to figure out who's going to be on their board, or they're trying to figure out who's the best people, to partner with. I think you always got to start with your vision and your mission. And I think it's important, like you said, Jay, with the case statement, that helps tell the story of your organization. It helps figure out what your unique factor is, why now, like what's the sense of urgency around this issue? And it helps to clarify, like, what's the problem? What's the need that you're trying to address? And it forces you to kind of pull together that research and that data to explain that, and the personal stories that you can share, and what's the outcomes that you want to see, and what's the change and transformation that you're looking for as a result of your organization. A lot of people don't actually sit down and write that out. They have it all stuck in their head, but they never take the time to write it out. And it's hard to like get people to rally behind that when it's just like a thought in your head and people don't understand it. So a case statement is helpful for that as well. And I think it's important to write out your program as well. Like, what is your program model? Who's your target population? What are the particular activities that you're doing for that to serve that population? What are the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? And then the budget, which I know a lot of people struggle with. People do not like writing budgets. I ask people all the time, what's your budget? Do you have a written budget? And they don't. So that's key as well, like having an organizational budget and then having budgets for each of your programs to even understand, what do you need the money for? Because that's a key question that any donor, any funder is going to want the answer to. So I think some of those pieces are really, really important to flesh out before you start applying for grants.
I wonder why it is that people have such difficulty with those two pieces. The budget, because this is a forward-looking budget you're describing now. It's important to know what they're spending currently, but it's also, as you said, vision and mission are in a case statement. And so if you're looking forward, then being able to describe what that vision is and how you're going to get there and what it costs to do it are all pretty important. So I wonder why people have trouble with that. And I wonder why people also have trouble writing down the personal story that informs that, so people can see it in a way that's, I don't know, with their heart instead of just their head. Can you talk a bit about what are the impediments and how to overcome them?
I've seen with budgets, people don't understand what budgets are. And I actually love the budgeting process because in my mind, it's a way to vision. It's a way to set priority, and it's a way to think about what you can do and what you're willing to do, what you want to push yourself to do. And I often talk about budgets with people who haven't who don't have a past budget, right? So I'm often talking about people who are starting with ground zero and they don't have anything to compare to, and they think they have to do a budget based on what they have in the bank now. And they don't think about like, what do we need to achieve over this next year? What are the activities that need to happen? What are the resources we need to make it happen? And what does that cost? Like, they don't have a concept of that. It's like, just like you said, it's forward looking and not looking back or looking at what's our deficit, basically. So people feel really depressed when they think about a budget because they're like, I only have $100 in the bank anyway. So why would I create a budget? But I have to kind of get them to think, what do you want to accomplish this year? If you know you want to serve these many people, what would that take? How many staff? What are the, materials you need to make that happen? And I like budgeting because it forces you to think about, how can we do it well? It's not just about how can we get by, because a lot of people do that too. Even with established organizations, it's like, let's just go year to year and try to maintain what we have. But I like using budgeting as a tool to think about, what kind of organization do we want to be? What are our values? How can our values be reflected in our numbers? And what do we need to do to get there? So it's a challenge to an organization to budget well. And people just don't talk about budgets like that. They don't think about it that way. So I think that's one of the biggest impediments. But Kimberly said we get depressed.
I know. I saw that. I wanted to say, Kimberly, we see you. You're not alone.
You're not alone.
And I wonder if the way you just characterized that, Tiffany, helps with that depression a little bit, because if you're able to look forward like that and say, we have a solution to the problem we've identified that we see in common, that maybe it's a little easier to get out of your head and out of your own way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to have the space to dream and to vision. That's why it's so important to start with the vision. The vision is your big goal of what, if we do everything that we need to do. I know you know this, Jay, but where will we end up? And you always start there. So I feel like when you're talking about money and you're thinking about how to raise money, you start with hope. Like, you don't start in a place of deficit about what we don't have. It's about what we can do once we have the money. So I think that's important for people to shift in that way.
Yeah. And we do have other comments from other people. I just want to make sure I acknowledge them. First of all, thank you to all the people who are just telling us about the size of your organizations and what you do. And you can see that there's a lot of people here in the room who are running through these same issues about figuring out how to do these things, and then how to go out there and seek some support. And Colin's writing, sometimes it's hard to go about a budget just because the startups not acquiring any funding. He does a lot of activities voluntarily but making us not have anything to document about budget until we get a grant. This is this kind of chicken and egg problem, isn't it? So you were talking about foundational pieces before you even go out, but for those who, as you put it earlier, only have 100 in the bank, how do you help them to kind of motor through that while they're building the foundational pieces to go out and seek some support?
I think, and we're still talking about budgeting, I would say the first step to a budget is establishing your goals. So before you put any numbers to anything, you think about where you want your organization to be a year from now if you're doing your yearly budget. And then you reverse engineer that and ask yourself, what will it take to get there? And then what are the resources you need to make that happen? So a budget isn't necessarily, a lot of people, when they budget, they think about what they've done already, right? And they're just like trying to maintain the status quo. But a budget is thinking forward, like, these are our stated goals. This is what we want to accomplish. This is how we want to move and grow as an organization. And so what are the resources we need to put in place? And then it's the challenge then to raise it. So the budget is the first place, but then you have to think about your fundraising plan, or, people call it a development plan. And what are the fundraising strategies you want to put in place to align with what you need for your cost? So I hope that makes sense for people listening.
And again, everybody do check in both within the chat and within the Q&A, so we can make sure they get your questions and other things addressed here. And we do have some comments right now, but maybe I can help us get to the next place, because I had posed some questions to you before we even began today, and I want to make sure that they give you a chance to talk about some of these elements I know everyone in the room wants to talk about. And one of those is about the title of the program about misconceptions, and the next is about identifying people who can help you once you've developed the foundational aspects. So can you talk to us just for a minute about common misconceptions nonprofits might have about grant funders? Like what do they think about them in the first place? Because maybe if we know what our biases are, it might help us to, think more clearly.
I think so a lot of people think that grant funders are interested in funding their whole organization. I think people think that grant funders kind of wholeheartedly or wholly fund the whole nonprofit industry. And so they're invested in taking your whole program and being the benefactor, or I always get the words wrong, benefactor versus beneficiary, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the first misconceptions. People always look to grants first. And I'm not sure why and where that comes from, but they always think that as long as I get this $200,000 grant, then everything will be solved for our organization and we can move forward without thinking about the limitations of grants. They can do a lot of things for your organization. They can help you scale up and all those kinds of things, but they don't always cover the necessary pieces to focus on your infrastructure, right? They may not cover all of your executive director's time, and you need that person's time to build and make partnerships and things like that. They may not cover HR or accounting. So I think that's one of the first big misconceptions. I think another one is that they're behind this wall and that you can't talk to them or you can't engage with them, when in fact, some of their job positions, that's exactly what they're supposed to do. Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we even had that as a question here, and I've heard that my whole life, right? And this person Magda wrote, I'm a consultant helping small to mid-sized nonprofits. I noticed a lot of grants are by invitation only. And I run into this a lot about the issue of, only doesn't accept unsolicited applications. So there's this perception that you can't even talk to people who are behind an institutional funder. Can you address that a little bit? What are the workarounds?
Sure. So first of all, every foundation is different. So when I'm talking about this, you just got to understand the context and know if you're dealing with a family foundation versus a corporate foundation versus a community foundation. They're all different. They're all structured differently. And even within those different categories, they may move differently. But at a basic level, I would understand who are the program officers within the foundation, if they have enough staff, because sometimes they only have one person on staff. But if they have a lot of staff, who are the program officers and what areas do they cover? And I would figure out who they are, and I would introduce myself, and I would email them and share information about the program and the good things that you're doing. I like to tell people to watch where they move. Who do they talk to on LinkedIn? Where do they go? What boards or committees are they a part of? Do they do a lot of speaking? What are their interests? What are the things that are signals to you that they care about, that you can find some alignment in the work that you're doing? And also for smaller foundations, if you know who's on their board, especially if they're in the local area, do you have any connections to those particular board members? Same kind of thing. Are they a part of the Chamber of Commerce? Where do they go? Where do they belong? What are their associations? And how can you become more aligned with who they associate with? That's the best way to kind of get behind the wall. And at the same time, though, you need to be building your visibility as an organization overall and building your credibility so that when they do see you, right, there's something that grabs their interest. There's something that makes them want to know more about your program.
Right. In fact, would you mind, I don't know if you have a story that's kind of readily at hand to make that tangible for people who still think, well, yeah, but I can't imagine how I do that with my local, whatever it is, Chamber of Commerce or business association, or how do I find that information? Have you worked with an organization where they really started from ground zero? And one of the things they did after they built the foundational aspects, including the case and the budget, that they needed to make connections that they didn't currently have, and some of the things that they did to do it?
So I'm going to call out two people, actually. And one of the people are actually on here. I saw his name.
Oh.
He's a good example. His name is Gerald Moore. He has a nonprofit called Mission Fulfilled 2030. And I, encourage him to share it in the chat. But I'm going to tell a story of a woman named Leah Angel Daniel. She's in Buffalo, New York. And Leah, she makes strategic partnerships. It's like she knows everybody in Buffalo, right? So she has joined leadership development cohorts. Every time that she goes to a bank looking for funding, she introduces herself and her organization. She talks about what she does. She makes sure she does a lot of presentations in the local community. She goes to, the business development office in her local area. And she's always visible. And when she goes to those meetings, she's introducing herself. She's talking about what she's doing. She's sharing the vision for her nonprofit. She works with youth who have exited out of foster care. And it's through those relationships that it doesn't happen overnight, but it's taken about a year or two. And Leah has now secured a grant for $200,000 based on her just talking and sharing about the work that she's doing, sharing her story with key people in New York State and in Buffalo, New York, and people vouch for her. And the thing is that because she knows people in many different spaces, those other people talk to each other. So once they hear about Leah and they say, do you know this person? And they begin to talk about the work that she's doing, that's how the momentum happens. So it's all about you planting the seeds everywhere you go and meeting people and not being afraid to share about your nonprofit. And that's what I mean about sharing your credibility, right? Increasing your visibility so that people have something to go back to when they're asking about your nonprofit or interested in your nonprofit. I hope that helped.
Yeah, that was such a great answer, and it also raised another issue for me, and I think for some in the audience. John had mentioned we have similar issues with our board. They don't really help us as far as connections, yet there are some members who complain that we aren't pursuing certain funders. I think we've all heard that kind of thing before, but I'll bet that there are probably even board members in this group today. You don't have to reveal yourselves if you don't want to, but if you want to tell us maybe what you do within your organization, if you're a volunteer, staff member, executive director, board member, that might be helpful to contextualize some of the conversation here. Because I imagine, Tiffany, that we have people within our sector, like all the founders you've worked with and work with now, that there are some of them who are in the same boat as some kind of junior staff member. In other words, they come in to do development, let's say, or work on program, and they feel like they have to go out and meet people for the first time, and that seems tough. Why aren't we getting help from our board? But if you talk to board members, I'm sure they also feel like they're kind of in the dark and trying to figure it out themselves. It's just a matter of applying some of the techniques you just mentioned. So I wonder, when you're helping organizations, is there kind of a different approach that you've taken from staff and board, or how do you work to build the confidence with board members themselves that they can be real agents of change and build those connections and help the organizations?
Sure. So full disclosure, most times when I work with organizations, they don't have staff. Like they're at a point where they don't have the resources for staff. So it's mostly how to get the founder, who may be on the board or maybe not, to engage their board members and to, do exactly what you just said, to get them motivated to help and extend their connections so that you guys can start asking for money. I think one of the things that I encourage people to do, the circle of influence activity, for people to think about who they're connected to personally, socially, professionally, what are the associations they're part of, the clubs they're a part of, and just encouraging it as an actual activity where you write it down and think about it. Because if you ask people like, who are your connections? Who can you, introduce us to? Sometimes people automatically go to, well, who do I know that's famous, or who do I know that has a lot of money? And when you start peeling back the layers about like, what are important connections you have at work, or where do you work? Right? Just even tracking that kind of information and then using that data to figure out, okay, we have these connections already. Let's make these introductions to the key people in these organizations so we can begin a conversation about how to support our work and help further our mission. So I think a lot of times it's just reframing, because people have weird ideas about fundraising, right? When you ask them to help with fundraising, they automatically think you want them to be like the closer. You want them to be the one to do all that. When really it could just be, who do you know? Like, who do you think would be aligned with our mission? Who would be excited about our mission? Who would want to hear more about this and would be interested in supporting? So it's probably more so asking better questions to get that information out of your board members.
Another thing I wonder about sometimes is if it's possible to help people to recognize who they know. that in like, for example, I don't necessarily know if I know somebody or not until I look at LinkedIn sometimes. Um,
Mhm.
but I wonder if there's a way to take names that maybe staff members identify to board or board members identify to staff or just people who are volunteers in an organization or the founders, if they can take a look at a list of people and then identify some people that actually maybe they know that they didn't realize they knew
Yes.
and bring them into the discussion. Is there any of that kind of peer screening that goes on with some of the organizations you work with?
Yeah, I think so. I think first encouraging people to be open about their connections and who they
Mhm.
know, and helping them realize that that's the key to fundraising. Because I don't think that I think people think, oh, we just need to contact LeBron James or Oprah and they give us a lot of money and that's how we raise money.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but it really comes to like who we know, and who we know would be compelled by hearing about the good work that we're doing. Some
Mm.
people like who are in your personal network, if they knew you were doing such good work or were associated with an organization, they'd be happy to give. But because we're often like quiet about the work we're associated with, people don't know. So it's just sometimes it's just them sharing a good story or them sharing their own experiences to get people in their network to be mobilized to help. But absolutely, I think it's important to do that screening and to help people see who could be a key connector. But also like helping the board along. Like sometimes you have to like spoon feed them.
Hmm.
So here's a template of a message that you can send on LinkedIn. Can you do that with 5 of your key connections over the next week? Or here's an email template that you can use to connect us. You don't even have to be the one to ask, but can you send a warm email? So then,
Right.
if I'm the founder, I can then take that conversation and then move it along. So sometimes it's just also like giving them exactly what you need them to do to help move it along.
Yeah, specific asks help a lot, don't they? I mean, if
Yes,
just imagine it's a dinner party and people say, "Yeah, come on over." Well, is there anything I can bring? Well, I don't know. How then we don't know what to do.
that's
So
right.
how is that any different with our boards if we don't give them specific directions? And speaking of specific requests, we did have from an anonymous attendee. My favorite guest is always anonymous. Is how do we reach out to Tiffany? And so before we go any further, do you mind sharing how people can find you?
Sure. You can find me on YouTube. If you type in Boss on a Budget, you will see my face. I actually go live every Sunday and I drop a video every Tuesday. I'm dropping one today about engaging your board and motivating your board, actually. And you can also visit me at www.bossonabudget.com.
And that doesn't mean you should leave because she'll be answering questions here that she may not address in that video. But one of the reasons I wanted to call out that question wasn't just so that those who might disappear will know how to find you, but also because that's, of course, how we connected. And that's why I mentioned LinkedIn before. So if a person wants to know more about a person, one place you can look is LinkedIn. It's not the only place to look, but it does mean that in addition to finding information about a person's background and where they are now. It may be sometimes hard to get their email address, but you can find out other things, maybe their website and or their YouTube channel. And if you're not watching Tiffany Allen's YouTube channel, you should be. But in addition to that, you can also see your level of connection to a person. And so all the things you've been talking about are that kind of 6 degrees of separation between us and Oprah that I think everybody in this call wants and almost none of us have, but they do exist. And so it's just a matter of framing that. And I know we're seeing more chat about that here, but I do want to make sure I at least ask a couple of the questions that I promised to ask you instead of just all this random stuff. So another one was, are there some shifts occurring that are influencing your recommendations to people, the kinds of advice you give to organizations? Because I think about this especially over the last 3 years.
Mhm.
There were a lot of uh, different areas of focus for the three kinds of institutional grant makers you mentioned, with government, corporate, and foundation, maybe even family foundation being a fourth.
Mhm.
And a lot happened to all of us in the last few years. And it wasn't all about COVID, but that was certainly one big factor. And now coming out the other side of some of that, but not all of it, and hopefully having learned something, how is it influencing the way that we're talking to grant makers, those we look for, the conversations we have? What's the change?
So when you first said your question, I thought the question was going to be how did grant makers change?
Well, maybe a bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking it could be both. I think initially, because the same time COVID was happening, I think the George Floyd murder shifted some things as well
Mm.
about how people talk about race and race equity and diversity. And there was a push to focus more on that and a push to fund more Black-led organizations. There was a push, especially because of COVID, to do more unrestricted funding.
Right.
Because usually most grants are program grants, so they're restricted. And so you can only use them on certain things. And so when you grant unrestricted money, then the organization has the power and the choice to use the money as they need to. Um, I don't know if that trend has continued. I get the sense that some foundations have kind of pulled back from that, especially because of the economy.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure if that trend will continue, but what I have seen, at least from my perspective around startups and grassroots organizations, more confidence in talking from their perspective and sharing their authentic stories. And I think for a long time, people didn't they weren't aware that they could share who they were, be themselves, and also be able to attract funding or also like do good work through a nonprofit. So I think that shifted. Social media has helped that as well, where we're looking more at like community organizations feel more empowered to be
Mm.
able to lead with their values, lead with their stories instead of like chasing money. Now, I think that's a really like idealistic way of looking at it, though. I think there's still the reality that you need funding, and not all funders are that progressive. Um,
Mhm.
and there's still that balance. But I do see like a shift in people like just being more authentic and showing like what it's really like, and showing their culture, like leading with their culture and being not afraid to do that instead of hiding their culture or hiding their differences, like embracing that more. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but do you mind talking about that a bit more? Because I wonder sometimes when it comes to the stage of, okay, they've written a case statement. They know that board members should go out there and figure out who their colleagues might be for second level degrees of connection. They are ready to do specific asks, send out an email or pick up the phone or whatever it is, meet somebody to invent. There's that next piece, which is, who am I here? And you were just talking about it. Am I representing the organization that next year is going to go from serving 6,500 people to 8,000 people with so many meals here and so many meals there? And here's the budget. And, it's very important, but it's almost cut and dry versus this is who we are. These are the values we espouse. That's very different sort of appeal and ask. Are you seeing that there's an opportunity to be more forceful, authentic? I mean, pick your adjective, way of saying this is who we are as well as this is what we do.
I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So I'm going to be honest, not all funders are there. Like not that's not attractive to all funders, but I
Right.
do think there's a space where, especially in the startup space, which is why I love working with startups, that you can start with who you are. Like you don't have to go through the process of hiding, who I really am. I'm not afraid to show what it's really like to do this work, not showing like the rawness of it all,
Mhm.
and then coming out and say, oh, now we feel comfortable. I think people can start there because they're starting their own organizations, and like I said, they're leading with their values. I think that you know social media and the ability to connect with more than just grant makers and major donors, the ability to connect with like people across the world and to get people energized and engaged with your mission. I think it helps to level the playing field a little bit more. And I know we're talking about grant makers here, but I do think like people being able to elevate their stories or like tell their authentic stories on free apps that can access anybody, like anybody can see that, I think is a game changer. And I do see an opportunity for people to use it and leverage it more, to show the real side of the work and what they do and who they are. I don't think it's that like in the professional space, I don't think that people have accepted it all the way, but I do think there's opportunity for growth there. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, in fact, I'm linking that in my head with a question I was going to ask you, and something that comes up a lot that has to do with authenticity, and that's credibility. And if organizations are out there and they're using a social media account as one of the ways that they communicate, which many do, then they have choices about what they're going to put in that pipeline that people may or may not see. And we often think about that as, you or me reading a Twitter stream or a LinkedIn post or a Facebook thing or Instagram. But it might also be a grant maker, or it might be a person who serves on the Family Foundation board, or a person who took an Avon Walk for Cancer, but they also are working as a senior VP for AT&T or whatever it is. So they're in their private life viewing what we send, but that may influence their view as a grant maker. So when you think about this, what are some of the ways that organizations can use different channels to build credibility with grant funders?
Sure, I can give some examples, and I'll just say, like, I've been in the position on behalf of grant funders. I've been told to look for programs that fit a profile, because there are certain funders that are looking for organizations, and these are foundations in particular that are only invitation only.
Right.
And so I've had to be on Google, or I've had to be on Facebook looking for organizations that fit a certain profile, because it's so hard to find organizations. It's so hard to see like what they do if they're not in our traditional circles or in our traditional networks. So I just want to throw that out there first, that there are some organizations that are actually looking for you, and you don't know where they're going to find you. But I often tell people the key to being discovered, especially if you're new, is to distinguish yourself. And I heard a grant writer say this. I loved how he described it. It was be the first, best, or only at doing something. But I like to talk about it as establishing yourself as an expert. Talk about an issue, or use an angle, a particular angle or focus of an issue that no one else is talking about, and just talk about it over and over and over again, and do written content, speak about it on podcasts, go to hearings, testify, present at conferences, join committees and talk about that. Like, create your platform, your issue, and distinguish yourself as a go-to. Because when people begin to see you as someone who, you're the only one talking about this issue, and you seem to know what you're talking about because you're talking about it over and over again, you're establishing trust, you're establishing credibility by doing that. So I think it's really important for people to hone in on an issue that's theirs and just go for it. And I think just the other piece to this is that this is a long game. I think people think if they post one social media post, or if they do one article or an op-ed, that like the money is supposed to come flooding in, but people need to see you show up over and over and over again before they want to take a chance on you, or before they may reach out to you. So I think the other piece is that you need to be consistent about sharing whatever message you have, or about whatever issue that you're highlighting, and just keep going, because eventually people will be attracted to you, but that consistency is what builds that trust in order for them to take that step to reach out.
What you said is so important, and it makes me think about what you talked about initially with the budget. When you're helping organizations budget for things, it sounds like you're also making sure they budget probably both time and resources for communications and for fundraising. Because if they don't have that money, then how would they consistently appear in all these places and be having these conversations? I even seen in larger organizations where people say, well, why spend the money on, and you can pick your thing, Twitter. Well, maybe it's a complete waste of time, or maybe it's central to our communications plan to be in front of people. So when people are looking for a trusted source on a particular topic, they turn to you. So how do you address that, especially, well, maybe in different contexts? Founding organizations kind of that have been around for a while, and organizations that are growing, should they carve out a particular portion of their time and budget for these activities? And if so, what's the guideline?
So I think the guideline just depends on the goal, the specific goals you have, and the capacity you have. So I can't, say a particular percentage, but to answer your question, I will say yes, absolutely. When I talk to people about raising money, I talk about communications and fundraising together. I don't typically separate them. I think you have to start with the visibility, and then with the visibility and the credibility and the trust that comes from that comes funding. So I think they're together. I don't think you can separate them at all. And it's important to establish your program as a credible program so that when people do see you and do discover you, they feel comfortable enough to take that next step to consider funding. So I think it's very important, but I wouldn't say, okay, you have to invest this amount of your budget to Twitter. It's wherever the people that you're looking for are, wherever they play, whatever, wherever they are, I would invest in showing up there and trying to make the connections where they show up.
Right. And we're getting some high fives on that from Collins and others. We did have a question also from Philomena, which I knew was going to come up eventually, which is, where do you find in, I almost said print sources. Does anybody use print anymore? In any kind of digital media or other research resources, where do you find lists of grant makers, but maybe more importantly, not just lists, but where you can search them by interest. And of course, I'll mention that DonorSearch has that data, but that's not the purpose of this session. It's also at places like GrantStation. It's certainly Foundation Center. Are there sources you use, or is there a list of sources that you use and recommended to places? Because there's usually a cost, and that's part of this budgeting process. Can you talk to how to find data?
Yes. So all the ones you mentioned, Foundation Directory is kind of like, the standard a lot of people talk about, but like you said, DonorSearch, GrantStation, Instrumental is a new service also that provides that, and they all come at a cost, and they're different costs. Like GrantStation is one of the more inexpensive ones, and I think the Foundation Directory online is probably one of the most expensive, and Instrumental is a little pricey, but for people who don't have the resources for that, right? You don't have that money in your budget. One thing that I like to do is just look at other nonprofits in your local area and see who funds them. And that's one of the easiest ways to start. But also identify, especially if you're small and you're local, identify like the local corporations in your area, who has a large presence in your area. Look at the banks. Look at your grocery stores, look at your utility companies. They all have foundations associated with them, and generally they have easier processes to apply. So you want to have a mix of different kinds of funding, and you want some kind of funding in there that's easier to get. And those opportunities tend to be a little bit easier. But if they're more visible, there may be more people, there may be more competition. So just keep that in mind. But there are ways to get around this. And also with the Foundation Directory, there is free access to some of your public libraries. So there are definitely ways to get around this if you don't have the money to pay for GrantSearch.
Right. And if some of these things are, they've changed their brand so many times, it's difficult to know. Someone in the chat had mentioned 990s, and I don't know if the 990 PFs and the 990s, which are different, one pertaining to not-for-profit organizations that don't give away their money, they're seeking money. That's most of our audience today. And then those who are trying to give money away and looking for good places to invest in the community, the PFs, I believe. But you may be able to find some of that data in places like GuideStar, which is now part of Candid, which owns the Foundation Directory. So it's complicated. But there's also ProPublica, which is another interesting resource. But I don't know if they have foundation grant making information, but they have great 990 data. Oh, they do. Okay. So that's another great free resource. But this is coming online all the time. It's always a challenge. And you just mentioned the local business community, which is very cool. So wherever you are, there's usually something like a chamber of commerce or something, but I don't know how you find those. It depends on what do you do to find them? Or the service organizations, places like that where you can be in front of people.
I look for places that serve them or sell to them that may have a directory of them. So if you're trying to look for a list of businesses, that's where I would start in order to find them. Your local United Way or nonprofit associations are ways you can find lists of nonprofits. If you're looking to see who supports local organizations and you want to check out the local nonprofit websites and see, how they get funding, is always a good way to do that too. So there are a bunch of different options for you. It's either time or money. Are you ready willing to invest more time, or do you just have money to invest?
Right. We did have a note from Gerald who had said some community foundations let you use the grant research tools for free. That just reminded me, I should ask you about community foundations specifically. Do you have any thoughts about their role in helping us to figure things out, getting to meet people, just providing general intelligence, or even acting as a conduit for support?
Yeah, so generally that's the role of the community foundation in your area. And I'm often surprised by how many people didn't know that community foundations exist. And even in our area, the local DC area, they're huge. The DC Community Foundation, I think they give like $86 million
Oh,
away
wow. No,
a
I didn't.
year.
Didn't know.
So in every local area, just about, there's a community foundation, and often there are many around you. So I'm in Maryland, and there are at least 5 I can name in my general vicinity that may cross over into your area that you could look into. But their job is to support like local philanthropy, and they can connect you with donors. And they also manage donor advised funds for people who want to give money away, but they don't want to create a foundation. So they may know of opportunities. So it's really important to connect with your community foundation, talk about your program, and partner with them and take advantage of the resources they have available. Every community foundation is different, but they may offer free space for you to hold things. Like Gerald said, they may offer tools for free. So it's just on you really to get out there and start making those connections.
Right. And I guess that's why they are there, at least in theory. So
Yeah.
they are, I guess, unlike maybe some family foundations which don't have a staff member, the community foundations have staff. And
Right.
you started by talking about that at the very beginning, about people being accessible and looking for opportunities. And that seems like almost a definition of a community foundation.
That's their job. Like a lot of these program officers, they have to talk to the community. They have to reach out. The issue is sometimes they stay within their bubbles, right? They stay within who they know, what they feel comfortable with. And I think that's the challenge in the funding space, like getting them to expand beyond just who they're comfortable with or who they're familiar with. And that's why I think it's so important for nonprofits to own their power and reach out to them and challenge them and build relationships with them. But I do think there is a responsibility on the funders as well. I don't want to just not hold them accountable, for them to be intentional about reaching out to community organizations and grassroots organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. Although maybe it's fair to also say they may not know you're there. It may be their responsibility, but perhaps it's the first time they learn. And since we've talked now about community foundations and you touched on donor advised funds, which are a big thing, we haven't talked at all about the corporates specifically or government. Now, I don't know if you can even, I'm asking a lot of questions in the space of an hour, but can you talk a little bit about government grants? I mean, if people tell me they don't want to hear about this in the chat, I'll respect it. But this is a big thing, especially where we both live. You're in Maryland. I'm on the other side of DC, and there's a lot of grants in the United States. They're not always easy to deal with, but it's a big part of our funding mechanism here and around the country. What's your experience with that, especially for small and medium-sized not-for-profit organizations?
So my experience with typically federal government grants is as a grantee and as a writer to get those grants, not as a funding agency. And so I would echo what you said, Jay. They are difficult, they are cumbersome, but they're useful, and they're an important part of your funding mix. So I would just say it takes a lot of time and effort to be in capacity to be able to not only apply for grants, but to manage them and to do the reporting and to understand the rules and the regulations about what you can spend money on and what you can't, and making sure your accounting aligns with what's required of you. So I would just throw that out there. And that is a barrier for small and new nonprofits. But it doesn't necessarily mean you can't pursue them. It's just that you got to be prepared to be able to accept that kind of funding. And one way you can leverage federal government funding without having to be the prime is to subcontract with another nonprofit. So you can partner up to do some of the work. And so your work is still funded, through another nonprofit by the federal government. And that's one way you can access it. And then also there's a lot of federal government funding that flows through the state and then flows through the locality. And so there are local grants and local programs that you can apply for by building relationships with local procurement officers and things like that, that people don't realize is actual federal money. They think it's state money because it's the state letting out the RFP. So there are ways to get around it. But I would just say, be prepared. You know, there's certain insurances you need to have when you get government funding. You need to think about your accounting, you need to think about your reporting requirements, all of that. And also consider that because it's government, they're often slower and they often fund on a reimbursement basis. So you often have to have money to cover the work. Like you often have to start the work before you can get paid by the government for that work. So just keep that in mind too.
Right. And I did get a note from Monday earlier, or Mary Monday, I should say, who said, yeah, let's talk about that another day. But I'm glad you addressed it because it is a big piece of the puzzle. And if people want, we'll do another session on that in the future, or maybe you can come back, Tiffany, and talk about that. But we did get a little encouragement from more talking about corporate grants, hearing both that's something we need to discuss, and also it's relatively easy. So let me first of all see what you think. Do you think the corporate side is easy? First of all, is it worthwhile? Second, is it easy? And do you have any tips for people thinking about where to find them and how to apply for them?
I think corporate grants are worthwhile. I think that people don't realize that corporations give directly. They don't just give through their foundations or through a separate fund. They also give directly. But a lot of that comes through either their employees. So sometimes they will have programs where their employees will select nonprofits, or they may have a volunteer program. And if you engage their employee volunteers, and they will fund you. And a lot of it's, again, through relationships. So start with who you know that work at corporations that you're trying to get in front of, and how can you be of value to them? And then work your relationships that way. So most of my experience is with foundations. But I will say with corporations, the process isn't as cumbersome, but it still takes relationships, right? Like you don't take anything for granted, but it still comes through relationships and thinking about who you know and who you're connected to.
We did have a couple of notes in the chat also about a couple of other issues, including international. And I think that may be beyond the scope of our conversation, especially with only 6 minutes to go. We've had other sessions on that topic in the past, and we would love to address that again. So please do come back, Magda and others, for that in the future. We do think that's important. In fact, maybe you can see the books on my shelf to know that I agree with you. When you were talking about this, as Jeff just pointed out, corporate giving is about relationships. Again, it seems like relationships are a common theme here, and you've been talking about that throughout, either identifying people with whom you can build a relationship, people you know already that you might be able to foster a new kind of relationship with, building credibility with people, all those things. Are there some common mistakes that nonprofits are making that you can kind of highlight that we can avoid? So these are the best practices we've been talking about a lot, or even better than best. What are some of the things we should try and not do?
I think it relates just to what you talked about. I have this saying, don't chase dollars, chase connections. And I think people lead with the money, like the need for the money a lot of times when they're looking for funding or when they're approaching anyone, honestly. And the value is in the relationship. The value is in the connection that you can make, and not necessarily what you think your end goal is, which is just the money. That's actually not the end goal. The end goal is to land a partner that can help put you in front of other people, who can help you, give you access to different networks, who can help you achieve your goal together. Like, you want to think about this as a partnership and not just, I need you to give me this money so I can do my program and go over here and get it done. So I think a lot of people, when they think about fundraising, they center so much on the money, and they don't think about like the importance of the connection and nurturing that connection. And when you're thinking about nurturing the connection, you think about how to continue that relationship. So even if you do secure a grant, what do you do after that? What's your thinking processes? Like, how do you share the great work, the impact of their money with them? And how do you circle back and talk about what more, you could do with even more funding? So, or who they could connect you with to help leverage their funding. So I think that one of the biggest mistakes people do is they chase money, they chase the dollars and don't think about connections. But that doesn't sound sexy. And for people, it seems like it takes forever, but it's worth it. Like that investment is worth it in the long term for your nonprofit.
That may actually be a good place to sort of wrap up, because if we can get people focused on the thing you've been talking about for 55 minutes, building these relationships and credibility and looking at tools and making sure our board members know what to do and their staff are fully empowered and all these things that you've been discussing, and then worry less about the money and more about the mission and the vision. That seems like a great place for us to be, kind of put a pin in it for our next conversation. Again, for those who may have missed it, how can people reach out to you, to your firm, but also just to follow you and like check out what you have to say about stuff?
Sure. Please follow me on YouTube. You can search Boss on a Budget and you will see me there. You can also visit me at bossonabudget.com. And I see a couple of people have questions for me. So if you want to email me, you can also email me at info@bossonabudget.com.
Thank you so much for this, Tiffany. We really do appreciate it. I appreciate it. And hopefully, at some point you can come back and chat, or we can meet in person and do this.
Absolutely.
Grants are a big deal. We rely on them. But we often make it seem so mysterious, and you've definitely made this a little more tangible and real. So I appreciate it. I want to thank you all for hanging out and being so participatory. That is really awesome. Come back for other sessions. We try to make it this conversational every single time, and that only works when you're here. So I hope you'll come back and join us next time. We have another session on Thursday with Starren Bird, who's a senior person at Salesforce, a firm I'm sure you know. We have new episodes in the podcast, which are really interesting, including a senior leader right here in Washington, D.C., who runs an organization that you'll find fascinating, great personal conversation. Lots of stuff coming up, including things right live from AFP in New Orleans. So I hope you'll join us for that. They'll be at all different times with some really interesting special guests, and lots of things throughout the year. I think we have 120 different programs scheduled. So really glad you could be here for this one. Hope you'll be here for future ones, but stay tuned for a minute, because you're going to see a few things come up on your screen, including a way where you can check out, at least through DonorSearch, in addition to the other resources we've mentioned, which include Foundation, the Foundation Center over at Candid and Grant Watch, Grant Station. I'm sure I'm missing some people, but DonorSearch also has a way for you to check for foundations and for institutional grant makers, in addition to knowing the rest of your people. So just a shout out to them for sponsoring the series, but also a way to address this particular question. You'll see that through a little QR code. So get your phones ready. You can take a picture of it, find out about your potential grant opportunities right there. So until next time, thank you. And again, make sure you follow Tiffany. See you all later.
Thank y'all.
Bye.